Well, it looks like we have gone through too many days with philosophical questions. Now it's time to go back to some more grounded reality. And the current week in Mythic Plus and in the raid, how have the specs been performing and the popularity of the specs. It's time to have our weekly report on the situation. This is starting to look a little bit like fantasy football, where you buy one of the specs hoping they are going to perform. And in case you haven't noticed, we have basically just passed the 2 months mark for the expansion. So it is a time of comparisons. We're going to look at the current situation in Mythic Plus compared to all the way back to about a month and a half ago, when people were still starting to push +10s, +11s, +12s compared to now, where groups are getting past the +20 and getting closer and closer to the +25 mark. Because when you compare things to a month ago, you can see the progression of the change. You can see the evolution of this current meta that we have in Mythic Plus. Because when it started, there was of course still a lot of hope and a lot of security in Resto Druid, right? Just coming off the last expansion, and just coming off the normal idea of a meta in Mythic Plus, Resto Druid was very, very quoted compared to other specs. And Restoration Shaman has never been a particularly popular Mythic Plus spec. So the chips were stacked in Resto Druid's favor. And as you can see, Restoration Druid was still, back in the day, the more popular spec in Mythic Plus. What has happened over the course of 5 weeks? Well, what has happened is that Restoration Shaman right now is, of course, still the more popular and more played spec as a healer, but the other important part is that on top of Restoration Shaman becoming the #1 spec, you could say for all content, because even in raids they are still the more popular spec, you can also see that Holy Paladin has gained more and more in popularity. The other, you could call it sad point, is that not really anything has been moved for Mistweaver and Holy Priest. They are still remained where they were before, and you can argue where they have been in previous expansions. Mistweaver Monk, to be fair, has gotten a few seasons off where they were still pretty popular, but Holy Priest never really been in that situation. And for them, it is also made harder by the fact that they have to share their class with a different spec. So whenever the sister spec is more popular, it becomes even harder for you to be even seen as a spec in your class. After the healers, you can then look at the tanks. This is, of course, the much easier thing to predict. Vengeance Demon Hunters, who are hyped in the beta, together with Protection Paladins for having massive amount of damage. And damage is seen very favorably in Mythic Plus, even as tanks nowadays. So over the course of 5 weeks, there has been a extremization of this point, where Vengeance Demon Hunter has gained more and more acolytes. These acolytes can be named also as Havoc Demon Hunters rerollers, migrating, fleeing from their spec, from their underperforming spec, to play the Flavor of the Month version of their class, which just happens to be tank this time around. The other thing to notice is that, much like Resto Druid, there was still some, comfortable hope for Blood Death Knight, particularly from people who didn't play or follow too much the beta. Blood Death Knight has always been a pretty popular tank, a pretty useful tank in both Mythic Plus and Raids, more often than not. So the start of the expansion, you had way more Death Knight players tanking than not. And then as weeks went by, we can just say that the hope in Death Knight started waning a little bit. So 5 weeks later, Blood Death Knight has dropped a lot in popularity compared to before, to the point where they are now weakly passed by every other spec except for Protection Warrior. Yeah, Protection Warrior, unlike the other spec, there was no bait there. Nobody was believing in Protection Warrior, nobody was hoping for them to be very popular, even considering their previous state in BFA. Throughout the end of BFA, nobody actually fell for it. When you look at the range DPS, you have a very clear visualization of what happened. The expansion starts, and you have a lot of young and hopeful specs, hoping to have some fun in Mythic Plus. And then 5 weeks later, turns out that everyone knows which of the specs are the strongest, so all of the weaker ones start dropping in popularity. You can see that Beast Mastery, and then Shadow Priest, and then Elemental Shaman, the other two mage specs, have all lost popularity in 5 weeks. Meanwhile, completely unsurprisingly, the 3 more popular specs, Balance, Fire, and Marksmanship, have all gained popularity. So they have all sucked the life out of all the minor, less represented specs. Now, could this be the same for melee DPS? It actually isn't. Melee DPS actually did not go the same way as ranged, because even within a month of difference, a lot of the specs have remained more or less the same, from Retribution Paladin to Arms Warrior to Havoc Demon Hunter. The real difference is that when the expansion started, of course, you did have the notion that Rogue would have still been very good in Mythic Plus, and that Unholy Death Knight was extremely powerful. Death Knight had been pretty popular in the beta, as in the notion that they would have been strong was popular in the beta, and if you remember, I mean, it's not that long ago, Unholy Death Knight in the pre-patch in BFA started doing very, very well. That was more so because they had some broken Azerite traits, which were further empowering the current version of Death Knight, which was making them much stronger than what they are now, but it still gave the impression to everyone that Unholy Death Knight would have been very, very powerful. So the real difference, when you compare the start of the expansion, the first couple of weeks of the expansion to now, is that green bar. Windwalker Monk started the expansion, you could say as usual, a rather niche and underplayed, underrepresented spec. And then over a month later, now they have just reached their personal record. This week is the highest week in representation for Windwalker of the expansion. We started following Windwalker when the poor little guy was at 7.7%, if you remember, and now they are at 16.9%, and they are within 1% of both Unholy and Outlaw. So looking within the difference of a month, you can see these type of changes much better. How people started realizing that Vengeance was very powerful, how they started losing hope in Restoration Druid and realizing that Restoration Shaman was much better, as well as slowly but steadily increasing the representation of Holy Paladin as well. For range DPS, you probably had the 5 stages of grief, where all the other range DPS slowly gave up on their spec and realized that the 3 main specs, the 3 flavor of the month specs, were just too popular, too requested by the groups trying to be formed in Mythic Plus, as well as the quick and strong growth of Windwalker Monk for the melee DPS. Now, one thing that's interesting though is that right now, for the first time, we can start talking about the Mythic Plus 20 range. Now, of course, the Mythic Plus 20 and up keys are very niche. You know, they are played by a very, very subsection of the population. Think about the fact that less than 3% of the player base is actually clearing plus 15s. Even talking about plus 15 Mythic Plus keys is alienating 97% of the player base. So when we talk about the plus 20, which is just 2% of all the people who have cleared a plus 15, which are at 3% of all the people who do Mythic Plus, you kind of get the picture about this very, very small fraction of the player base. The reason why I want to talk about this is because there are some pretty interesting changes in the specs. So I want to ask you, particularly the specs affected by this, why do you think this is? Because when you look at tanks, okay, tanks are obvious. If Vengeance Demon Hunter is already easily the more represented, when you start looking at plus 20s, they are of course even more so, right? 70% Vengeance tanks in plus 20s, it's expected, it's okay, it's not very surprising. Also, to absolutely no surprise, range DPS. You have seen the evolution over a month, where all the other less played specs got played less and less, so of course when you look at plus 20, no reason for any of those underrepresented specs to suddenly gain a growth in popularity. Balanced Druid, Fire Mage, and Marksmanship are essentially the only specs played in plus 20. The interesting stuff comes in healers and melee DPS. Why is that? It is that because in plus 15s and up, you see that Unholy Death Knight is still very, very popular. They are, as of right now, the more represented specs in Mythic plus 15 and higher keys. Yet, when you look at plus 20s, 21, 22, 23, Unholy Death Knight basically disappears, alongside all the other specs that are not Windwalker and Outlaw. So this puts the growth of Windwalker in an even bigger scope, because they aren't just reaching up in popularity in the more accessible keys, the plus 10 to 14 range and then the plus 15 range, but even in the absolute highest keys, even in the MDI level of keys, you know, the very, very top level content, they have already passed Unholy Death Knight. So the question here is to be posed to all Windwalker monks, why do you think you're better than an Unholy Death Knight? And the question to Unholy Death Knights is why, even though you are so popular in the 10 to 19 range, the moment you start going in the absolute highest keys, you just disappear, and you get replaced almost completely by Windwalker. One of the answers could of course be the nerfs. Remember that on the 15th of December, Blizzard had their first round of balance changes, which also touched on Unholy Death Knight. Their mastery, which is something like 95% of their damage, was nerfed by 20%. They were the only popular melee DPS spec that was touched by nerfs. All the others were buffed, although none of the buffs actually touched popular specs, because Havoc, Assassination, Arms, and Fury were buffed. So it's not really going to touch any of this popularity in Mythic Plus. So it's interesting to wonder exactly how Unholy Death Knight lost so much when you look at the top level content. In a similar vein, we have to go and look at healers. because we mentioned that Holy Paladin had been growing in popularity and Restoration Druid was losing popularity. Not at the same rate as Windwalker was gaining popularity, but still, it was a nice, steady growth for Holy Paladin. So when you look at the plus 20 keys, the absolute highest content, you see that Restoration Shaman is still there, is still chilling, but the main change is that Restoration Druid basically halves its player base, goes down to 14% of healers in high keys, and Holy Paladin goes all the way up to 27. You see that it isn't just Holy Paladin going to 27% representation and comfortably passing Resto Druids, but Resto Druids also go below Discipline Priests. So in the highest level of content, Resto Druid is currently the 4th healer. Now, I am too lazy to actually go and check when has it ever happened in the history of Mythic Plus that Restoration Druid was the 4th more popular healer in the top level content. I'm going to venture a guess, and say never. And say this is the first time Restoration Druid has been this underrepresented in Mythic Plus. So this is also the question for healers. Restoration Shamans, you get no questions. The only question is how hard will the nerf be in 9.1 to Resto Shamans. The question is more around why is Holy Paladin gaining so much more ground than Resto Druids? Is it something we are not seeing? Something like all the strongest DPS, Balanced Druid, Fire Mage, and Marksmanship Hunter are all Night Fae, and so is Restoration Druid, but Holy Paladin isn't. So for the highest keys, you want your spread Covenants to cover all the buffs you can gain in dungeons, for example. Is it maybe because of the damage, or something we have been missing about the healing power? I mean, I think I know, but I'm gonna leave the answers to you. Now, for our report, we turn the page and we look a metaphorical minute to the raid. Once upon a time, the raid performance looked like this. Now, I'm not gonna go over this again, comparing all the specs and what changed in a month or so or whatnot. I just want to talk about one point, which is this one. So, Marksmanship Hunter and Unholy Death Knight, they are slipping lower and lower in the middle of the pack. It has been a slow but consistent decline over time, even when bosses of different types of damage profile were getting killed more and more. So maybe one of the specs with very good, for example, AoE like Marksmanship could have gained a lot more overall damage, but instead it's just been a continuous decline. So we do know that since the 15th of December, there has been a nerf. As I mentioned already, there was the 20% mastery nerf to Unholy Death Knight, and then there was the 5% damage to Aim Shot and Arcane Shot to Marksmanship. But that was the 15th of December. That was a long time ago. Could that just be it? Is it just the nerfs that created this, that caused this? One of the points I made about Unholy when I was talking about how much damage they were doing in all scenarios, if it was 1 target, 2 targets, 5, Unholy always had their burst which functioned for everything. You even had the point that certain people were complaining about that they didn't even have their best in slot legendary yet, even though Frenzied Monstrosity was at best an even legendary with Deathless Coil. But even when you look at all the different damage profiles, Zymox and Hungering Destroyer being the pure single target ones, Altimore being a 2 target with shades of 4 target plus burst in the middle, Sunken Salvation having a lot of AoE, and Inerva Darkvein having up to 4 target burst AoE phases, Unholy Death Knight is still chilling in the 7th to 8th place on average. It doesn't even break top 5 in basically any fight. Whereas Marksmanship gets even worse. Marksmanship has fights where they even slip in 10th, 13th range, like Hungering Destroyer where they are 8th, or Zymox where they are even 15th. Even though on Artificer Zymox you can say Hunters have to do the seeds, so they lose more DPS than the average spec. They do still seem to have their burst on lock, their Wild Spirit burst, because on fights like Inerva, for example, they are fighting for top 3, unlike Unholy Death Knight. So this is kind of the question. How hard do you think the nerfs have hit these two specs? But more importantly, or if they haven't hit them at all. If the initial first few weeks of raids simply were misrepresenting the actual power of the specs, and this was just how they were supposed to be, how they were supposed to function and to perform. As for the sad part, the specs at the bottom, no real change really. The buffed Assassination is still at the bottom. Arms and Fury pretty much happened what was expected. They still would have been pretty weak and underperforming, but Fury would have ended up outperforming Arms simply because of the buff they have received. The only spec that seems to have gotten where it was expected after the round of buffs is a Frost Mage, which is now middle of the pack. It is also helpful that more and more guilds are progressing through Sun King Salvation, the Keltas fight where Frost Mage is 7th, and even Inerva Darkvein, where Frost Mage is actually 5th and beating Fire Mage due to the burst, the AoE cleave burst they can do whenever the adds are spawning on Inerva. So they do seem to be picking up again in terms of damage, but then again we are still left with a problem that was put forward when the round of buffs was announced, which is, okay, some of these specs now are doing better with the round of buffs, but the only thing this is going to create is that now people are going to be looking at the other specs who are now at the bottom, like Beast Mastery Hunter, Frost Death Knight, and Havoc Demon Hunter. When it comes to the popularity of the specs in raids, there is one thing worth mentioning, because I foreshadowed this, or rather spoilered this, a week ago, which is that this is the week where Vengeance is going to pass Brewmaster Monk in popularity, and it did happen. Vengeance is now the most played tank in raid encounters in Mythic, passing Brewmaster by a couple thousand logs. The other specs are still chilling where they were before, no real gain or loss in their representation. This was, as I mentioned, inevitable. As the time goes on, more and more disenfranchised Havoc Demon Hunters, desperate for a raid spot, were going to reroll to Vengeance. After all, you can still keep the same gear going from Havoc to Vengeance, even if it's not as min-maxed. And then, with a little bit more time, you would have gotten tanks to simply reroll an entire class. I've seen this firsthand myself already. I've seen Prot Paladins, I've seen Blood Death Knights in particular, rerolling to Havoc Demon Hunter. So it took a bit of time to get here, but now we are here, and more likely than not, we're gonna finish this first tier with Vengeance Demon Hunter solidly at the lead as the more popular raid tank. When it comes to healers, it is still the same thing. Restoration Shaman is still by far the more represented, followed by Holy Paladin, which is getting slightly more and more ground than the other specs. Still though, don't get, too tricked by these representations. You would think, looking at this, that things like Holy Priest and Restoration Druid are still, not as popular as Holy Paladin and Restoration Shaman, but they are still doing very, very well. Of course, when you go and look at the hardest bosses, you see that the representation actually looks like this. If you look at the overall representation, Restoration Druid and Holy Priest are supposed to only have less than half the representation of a Holy Paladin and about a third of the representation of Shamans, but in here, the difference is much, much bigger, much wider. Council of Blood is pretty big, Sludge Fist is of course even bigger in difference, so it is bound to happen when most of the guilds trying to progress on the last bosses are going to go for double Resto Shaman, double Discipline Priest, and one Holy Paladin, or a combination like this. So the other 3 specs left out are going to have much, much less representation going in the later bosses. And this was all for the report of the day. We have continued seeing the rise of Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus, as well as the rise of Windwalker Monk in Mythic Plus. We have the questions about the switch in representation in the highest keys of Mythic Plus between Restoration Druid and Holy Paladin, as well as Windwalker Monk and Unholy Death Knight. And then when it comes to raids, beyond the more obvious and expected continued rise of Vengeance and the continued dominance of the 3 specs with damage reduction in the harder, later bosses of the raid, we do have the drop, the slow but rather continuous drop of Marksmanship Hunter and Unholy Death Knight in their performances. So, we will see each other tomorrow with, I don't know what. You will see for yourself in about 24 hours. Now I have to go. I will leave. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I have to go and give my dog his morning walk.